access it. Oh, perfect. Thanks so much. Thank you, Sandra, first off, for bringing me into this project. Otherwise, I wouldn't even be here with you all today. And Claudette for the land acknowledgement. Thank you so much. So I am just going to share my screen so you guys can see my beautiful presentation. All right. So, oh, we're on slide 12 here. I'm so sorry. Sorry, I was just going through this presentation earlier, and now I got to start it over from the beginning here. I'm so sorry. Just a moment. I just gotta wait for my computer to respond here. It just kind of froze up as soon as I started my presentation. Love the technical difficulties.
I just wanted to mention while you're doing that, Lauren, that if anyone has questions while Lauren is doing her presentation, please write them in the chat box. And then at the end of her presentation, she will answer any questions you have. So when you're doing it and you think of something and you don't want to forget, just write it in there and she'll get back to you.
Yes, thanks for mentioning that, Sandra, because I know often in presentations, I'll think of a question midway through, and then by the end of the 30 minutes, I may not necessarily remember that. Okay. I'm so sorry. My computer is being so slow right now. All right, so present. All right, we're at the beginning of the presentation here. I'm going to share my screen again. A minute now. So just while this is loading, I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about why I started going to school for agriculture in the first place. So sometime in the midst of high school, I kind of had this revelation about how important all of these systems are, not just for how they provide food, but how they also clothe and shelter us and provide us with fuel. And it kind of dawned on me just how much of an impact these systems are having on the environment. So I kind of learned more about that during my time at Trent. And admittedly, it was not always the most hopeful area of study. There can definitely be a lot of doom and gloom around the agriculture or the environmental sciences in general. Since, as I'm sure you all know, we've seen a lot of unprecedented changes over the last few decades in terms of extreme weather patterns, hurricanes, flooding, droughts. And this all has a huge impact on our food system. So I wanted to kind of just look deeper into that because we definitely can't overlook these changes, and we kind of need to start asking ourselves what changes are being made because of the agricultural system and maybe what we can mitigate those. All right, so hopefully the presentation shows up on everybody's screen here momentarily. Beautiful. Okay, so here is what we know. Agriculture is one of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gases. And in just Canada alone, it makes up 8% of our nation's emissions. And this is just the farming aspect of our food system. So this doesn't necessarily take into account other things like transporting and food waste. But in general, it's not really looking too good for agriculture at this point. But there is something about this all, that holds a little bit of hope. So agriculture also holds great potential for helping to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. So although this might sound directly counter to what I just said, it's all about the way we set up and subsidize our farming systems. And there's one not so secret component that really holds all the answers on how this can be done and what we kind of need to get there. So it all starts with the soil. Soil is the biggest carbon storage we've got. It holds up to 3 times the amount of atmospheric carbon and 4 times the amount of carbon held by all plant and animal life on Earth combined. So finding ways to increase the soil carbon storage and ways to offset the practices that release carbon from the soil, like tillage. So all this is critical for reversing the impacts that we're making. So when we look at the soil as being made up of living things, which it is, each with its own role in the soil ecosystem, there are all sorts of clues that we can find on how we can work with it and enhance the processes that support it. And as a result, we can build food systems that are more self-sustaining and regenerative, and that give back to the soil rather than simply mining it. So with that, I'm going to tell you all about how our current systems are set up and how we can kind of rebuild them. So a paradigm is a way of thinking about things in general. So what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about is the industrial agricultural paradigm. So this is kind of the dominant way of thinking about how agriculture should be done. So since the Green Revolution, about 70 or so years ago, synthetic fertilizers and fossil fuels became widely available and mechanization became the norm. So big tractors, big combines, big harvesters, they wanted to boost their agricultural outputs, and this was really helped along by the Haber-Bosch process at the time. So this was right after the Second World War, and this was a technology that was actually born out of a need to craft explosives. So this chemical fertilizer, nitrogen, it is super available to plants. So, and it's one of the most limiting plant nutrients. So when you add a whole lot of nitrogen where it wasn't before, you see really big boosts in agricultural outputs. So this combined with more widespread use and availability of mechanized farm equipment like tractors, plows, combines, irrigation systems, all of this combined led to an adoption of monoculture systems where vast areas of land were planted with a single crop, and we still see this today. So farmers that had previously had polycultures, these systems where you would grow lots of different kinds of crops all side by side in the same area, this was actually discouraged from, they were discouraged from doing this because it was actually heavily subsidized to start farming in these ways where you were doing a whole bunch of corn, for example, or a whole bunch of wheat. So this was to feed all the growing population. So people needed food, they needed a way to make lots of it, and all of these different technologies and practices combined, we've been producing record-breaking amounts of food year after year doing stuff like this. But at what cost? Really, it's kind of paradoxical. While we have these agricultural systems that rely on techniques that we know are damaging the soil, the water, our health, which actively contribute to climate change, and the ways that climate is changing, they're making it increasingly difficult to grow our food. So this is kind of like a double entendre, so to speak. So without soil organic matter, without predictable weather patterns, without the water we need to irrigate our land, we really just can't grow anything. So the loss of biodiversity, the pollution of soil and water, the erosion, all of this stuff is kind of counterproductive to what we need to grow our food. And it's also contributing massively to greenhouse gas emissions. So now we're going to get into the regenerative agricultural paradigm. So this is kind of counter to what we were just talking about, and it's sort of an umbrella term that refers to all different kinds of agricultural systems that acknowledge the importance of the soil ecosystem and use practices that support its health. So it pretty much just aims to regenerate soil organic matter, soil nutrients, the beneficial organisms living within the soil, all while minimizing the impacts on the environment. So this is pretty much a way of looking to work with the environment rather than against it, which is what we see so often in conventional agricultural systems. And one noteworthy thing, I just wanted to make a distinction between organic agriculture and regenerative agriculture, because that might be one of the first things that pops to mind when you hear the term, but they're not necessarily the same thing. So an organic farmer is not necessarily using regenerative practices, and regenerative farmers aren't necessarily using organic practices. They do overlap in some ways, but organic is more about like a certification and about, you know, a list of certain chemicals you can and can't use. So I just thought I'd make that distinction, that organic is not the end all be all of good agriculture. So in these beautiful pictures I've got on the slides here, we have a couple of examples of what would be considered regenerative practices. So in the top section here, we see no-till. So that is just a system of growing plants where rather than taking all of the residue off or tilling it all into the soil, you leave it on the surface of the soil. It keeps CO2 and water where it's supposed to be, and it reduces soil erosion, because rather than plowing your entire field, you're just planting your plants right into that crop residue and everything stays in its place. And another example just below that is cover cropping. So when you have bare soil, it's really problematic in terms of all of these things that I've been talking about. So releasing CO2 into the air, loss of soil, loss of water. We really don't want to have the soil uncovered. So a cover crop, which is when you would just plant, say like clover or winter wheat or some kind of inexpensive seed like that, and you cover the area so that it's not exposed to the elements, because this is really what contributes to things like the bacteria, the organic matter, all of those things in the soil that are kind of supporting those crops in return. This is the way to do it. And this isn't new. So these are practices that have been date back millennia. Like people have been doing it for a really, really long time. We've just kind of become divorced from it through this swap that's happened over the last 70 years since the Green Revolution. So there's all sorts of evidence that these types of practices do a whole lot of good and benefit, even if it does seem like, you know, a little bit of extra work from the farmer to have to plant, you know, a field after they've already harvested. It makes a big difference in terms of how healthy their soil is going to be and how much yield they're going to get the year after. And it keeps the carbon in the soil where we want it, which is really the most important thing when we're talking about the effects of climate change. So here is a really lovely chart that I found when I was doing my research for this presentation. So it just gives you the lowdown on kind of the 5 principles of regenerative agriculture. And pretty much it just sums up what I was talking about pretty nicely here. So we want to reduce the amount of tillage, keep the residues on the soil, maintain a living root. So those roots, when they stay in the soil, they hold the soil in place and they prevent it from eroding away. Crop diversity. So this is kind of the opposite of what I talked about with monoculture. You want to have lots of different things, because this way you have something that's more like mimicking a natural ecological environment rather than just trying to grow all one thing, because as anybody who's tried to grow stuff knows, there's going to be weeds, there's going to be other stuff. So it's really kind of fighting against nature. And integrating livestock into agriculture, which some people might think like, oh, like livestock, doesn't that contribute to climate change? And counterintuitively, it's really important to integrate these animals into our cropping systems, because they are super efficient at recycling nutrients and putting them back into the soil. So now I'm just going to chat a little bit about what's going on in Algoma in terms of agriculture. So pasture, forage, and livestock make up a huge part of our local agriculture. As anybody who lives in the area knows, when you drive around, you see a lot of fields with big brown bales in it, just like in the picture on the slide here, or cattle or bison in the fields. And this makes up around 30 to 40% of what goes on in our farming community. So there's other things coming up like oilseed, grain, and vegetable production. Those are all growing areas as well. But what we see is that there's actually, when we look at those principles of regenerative agriculture and we look at what's going on in Algoma, right away we see how that last principle is being integrated already. So when we have livestock on the pasture and they're recycling nutrients back into the soil, that really is it's so beneficial. And like, why get a bunch of manure and spread it all over your field with a big machine where you could just have these rotating grazers? So they've been villainized in terms of agriculture as far as I'm concerned. So when we have the manure being actively integrated back into the soil, it really contributes to the soil's health. Oh, some of these in there. So even though in Algoma we may not be feeling the effects of climate change as severely as some other places in the world, we're definitely not immune to it. So things like drought, I'm sorry, I've got a 2-year-old trying to get into my room right now. Over, I'm trying to do a presentation, okay? I need you to stay in the living room. Thank you. I'm so sorry about that. So finding ways that we can actively adapt to the challenges that are being presented by climate change and reducing our carbon footprint is a super big priority, even if we're not feeling the effects of it as strongly as other places. So how do RAIN's projects and programs tie in? So the SNAP program is, for one example, so what happens to the SNAP program, the long form is the Sustainable New Agri-Food Products and Productivity Program. So this is financial support for farmers or food suppliers who are looking to adopt new techniques, especially ones that contribute to their long-term sustainability and environmental sustainability. So something like no-till, for example, there might be a financial barrier for a farmer who wanted to adopt something like this because it requires specialized equipment other than what they've already have access to. So they might apply for SNAP funding so that they could get, that equipment and continue their production more sustainably. And the next one I'm going to talk about is the Alternative Legumes Project. So what this project was all about was analyzing the productivity of different legume forage types to see which ones were best suited for the climate here in Algoma. So for anybody who's interested, bird's foot trefoil and alfalfa are the 2 best performers. They outperformed red clover and galega. So if that means anything to you, I'm happy. But so what is so important about this variety selection is it allows people to have a better yield without, potentially having to put more inputs in. So if you select a variety that's not so well suited for your climate, you're going to have trouble getting that yield without, maybe extra irrigation or extra nutrients. But when you have something that's better suited that is going to perform well, then you don't have to worry about all those extra inputs. And the third project I'm going to talk about is the Keyline Plowing Initiative. So this was an investigation on this plowing technique that's just depicted here in the bottom photo. And so they were testing to see if it would increase water retention and distribution in response to unpredictable weather conditions. So this technique has turned out to be really successful in places like Australia. However, here they found that the hypothesis wasn't actually supported. So although the results weren't what was expected, it's still important to do this kind of research because it gives farmers, it helps them to make these informed decisions about whether these practices are going to be beneficial or whether they're going to work for our soil and climate type. So what can we do as consumers? So Buy Algoma, Buy Local is another initiative of RAIN's that focuses more on the consumer side rather than the producer side of things. We know what farmers can do to support the environment now. I've kind of told you a little bit about that, how they can support the soil and the environment. So the best thing that we can do as consumers is to support them in return. And the best way to do that is making sure that we're buying locally whenever possible. So here are just a few reasons why buying locally makes a difference. So it reduces the distance your food has to travel to make it to your fridge. As I'm sure you can imagine, carrots that come from California generate a lot more emissions than carrots that come from Third Line or Echo Bay when they're brought to the local grocery store or the local market here. Also, you can imagine in comparison that the carrots that come from just a few kilometers away are going to be way more fresh and nutrient dense than the carrots that have been shipped all the way from California. So Aside from this, buying locally also makes it easy to eat what's in season. So you may have started to hear more about seasonal eating, and that pretty much just means eating what's growing right now at this time. And farmers markets are great for that because you show up at the farmers market and any produce that you see, you know it's either been grown within the last few weeks or it's been maybe stored for the winter, things like roots and potatoes and stuff like that. So it makes it really easy to eat what's in season because you can just show up and see what's in season. So, and this way of buying also eliminates the middleman. So when you buy from the grocery store, we know that produce has gone from the farm probably to a warehouse where it's sorted and shipped off to other places like grocery stores and stuff. So it's gone through a lot of hands by the time it makes it into your own grocery basket. But when you buy from the farmer's market, we know this isn't the case because oftentimes you're speaking directly to the people that have grown the food. And this way you can even ask the farmer, like, hey, how do you grow this stuff? Like, do you have a greenhouse? Like, how much land do you have? Like, it's a learning experience as well when you go and you're able to talk to these people firsthand. And in turn, the money that you're using to buy your food is going directly into the grower's hands, which is then recycled back into the local economy. You can rest assured that what you're paying when you're buying that bundle of carrots is going to be a fair price that leaves the farmer better off in the long run. So not only does this support the local economy, but as we give local farmers more of our business, this gives them the opportunity to increase their own capacity. So for example, they might be able to invest in a greenhouse to extend their growing season, or they might have tile drainage installed in areas that they normally wouldn't be able to grow in because they're too waterlogged. So just in general, when we support our local farmers who are these stewards of the land, they fundamentally understand that their success is determined by the health and the fertility of their soil. So if we really want to help protect our local biodiversity and our local environment, then supporting our local farmers is a great place to start. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about some local producers that I kind of did some research on when I was preparing for this presentation that I kind of caught my eye. So the first is Valleyfield Farm. So they offer organically grown veggies as well as pasture-raised chickens, pigs, Angus cattle, and lamb. So they're really going for, they're like the polyculture that we were talking about. They really, they have all different offerings and they're also integrating the livestock. So we can really see that regenerative agriculture at play there. And same with the Grand North Bison, which is just this next picture here. So they have been family owned and operated since the 40s, and their herd are grass-fed. And as I was doing my research on this, I was reading through their website. They say that bison are actually believed to cause less erosion and compaction to the soil compared to conventional cattle herds. So that's just another way that they're considering how their practices are affecting the health of the soil. And Jardin Farm, they have been operating since 2017, I believe, and they also focus on the health of the soil and creating a farming system that is sustainable for the land and the farmers. So one fun thing that caught my eye as I was looking through their webpage, I think it was their Facebook page, they uploaded a video of this new, it would look like a giant washing machine pretty much. And what they do is they tumble all of their root vegetables in this giant slow motion washing machine as there's like the spray of cold water that comes down on it. And at first it's just like, oh yeah, that's a pretty cool way to do that. But what they mentioned in their caption is finding ways of doing stuff that take the stress off of their own bodies is actually helping to make farming sustainable for them in the long run. Because sustainability, when we talk about farming, not only is it about the land and the soil, but it's also about the people who are doing it, because we don't want miserable farmers. Those are the people who are feeding us and taking care of the soil. So I thought it was really cool to see the way that they could make that like a more enriching experience for them and less toil. So that is all I've got to say on the matter, and I'm prepared to open the floor here for any questions. It looks like there's some stuff in the chat, so. All right, let's see what we got here. So many questions about bees. All right. All right. Yes, Jonathan mentions that the secondary crops can be used as feed for animals, which is so true. Cover crops and stuff like that. Once you have a cover crop, you can just let those animals right out to feed on there. Like one example would be turnips or Swedes. So if you are growing these turnips as a cover crop, it keeps your soil in place, it's keeping the nutrients in place, and then you can let your cows, for example, out onto the field and they're just munching happily. So it's really cool the way that we can see the ways that these cycles, it's creating like a cyclical rather than just a linear way of doing things. Okay, so that was all that was in the chat. Somebody recommended Kiss the Ground, the documentary. Chelsea Brunel, what are some of the best practices to start to aid this issue ourselves, aside from being local? So growing on your own property, that is a great example. I'm an avid gardener. I love just getting my hands in the dirt and growing stuff. And, you know, there's definitely like successes and failures involved in that. But even just like as the learning experience, like when you take the time to try and grow something, it gives you so much more appreciation for the people who do that, or the people who are like, you know, out there harvesting and weeding and taking care of these crops in the field, because otherwise, what would we have to eat? Like, I know my garden last year, it was, you know, I got a lot of stuff, but it was by no means going to feed my entire family, especially not over the course of the winter, right? So I think that's a great recommendation. Just learning what it's all about, gaining an appreciation and an understanding of it, because once you have that knowledge and that understanding and that awareness, then it's in every decision that you make, you know what I mean? So that awareness is what, you know, that little voice in the back of your head that says, you know, maybe I should go to the farmer's market this Saturday and get my carrots and stuff there instead of, you know, getting it at Walmart or the grocery store. So pretty much just being aware. That's my biggest thing, because so often when I talk to people about this topic, or just, you know, anything to do with agriculture and growing things, there's such a disconnect. People don't seem to know what goes into it, or where it comes from, or how much effort, or what these systems are like. So it's just an eye-opening experience. So does soil type affect regenerative agriculture approaches? Thanks, Peter. I appreciate your encouraging comments. So soil type. So when I mentioned just at the beginning, regenerative is like an umbrella term. What I really mean by that is it's going to look a little bit different depending on every farm specific situation, right? So if you're like, for example, if you have super clay soils, like that's going to affect the way your water is draining, versus if you have sandy soils, you know, you're going to have a really quick draining soil. So all of these types of landscape features are what the farmers have to think about when they're making their decisions. And that's kind of where people like RAIN come in. I meant to mention, RAIN does soil testing. Soil testing, so important. So it allows for the farmers to see the nutrient amounts in their soil, and based on that, they're making informed decisions about whether or not they need to fertilize their crops. So rather than just, you know, blindly applying whatever recommended amount, when you have these services available, you can do it agriculture in a more precise way. So rather than just adding a bunch of unnecessary inputs that are just going to get carried away, you know, on the second or third rainfall of the season, it's doing it in a more precise way that's saving those inputs and saving the farmer money also in return. So local age manure for your little veggie garden. So I recommend Lemieux's compost, because they have a really great product. I found it was like, it didn't stink. It's slightly vermicomposted, so it's like really nutritionally dense. That's what I used for my garden anyways. They deliver it in the cubic meter, so if that's like a little too much for you, you can buy it in bags at B.Sc. They have it in just like the small $6 bags or whatever. What, in your opinion, are the risks to bees from pesticides like neonicotinoids? I'm so glad you asked, because this directly relates to what Susan Chan, Dr. Susan Chan. So when I was helping her with her research, what she was doing, she was looking at the effects of neonicotinoids, not on honeybees, which seems to be, you know, everybody knows about honeybees, but she was looking at ground nesting bees. So she was looking at this very specific species of bee, the squash bee, and they make their nests in the grounds around, like very close to squash plants, because they're like they're a specialized pollinator. They only like those specific types of plants. So what she did these different types of neonicotinoid applications. She did a foliar one, like on the leaves. She did a seed coating and a soil application. And after all of the testing and all of the bee observations, so that was my job. I would sit and I would time the little bees and see how long it took for them to forage for their pollen and stuff like that. And she compiled all this data and she looked at the effects on them. So like, how is this affecting the amount of eggs they're laying, or how is this affecting their behavior? So it turns out that the soil applications, when you're putting things directly in the soil, it is having an impact on these bees. And it makes them slower, it makes them unable to forage for pollen as effectively, and lay fewer amount of eggs as well. So that's just one way. So it's crazy to think about how all of these systems are connected and how doing one thing here might affect something over there, right? So another thing about neonicotinoids is when it was used for a seed coating for corn as a powder, what was happening was it was getting blown by the wind into hedgerows. So even though corn doesn't get pollinated by bees, bees don't like corn, it's a wind pollinated crop. They really like the flowers and the wildflowers in the hedgerows, right? So they're going to these bushes that are coated in pesticides, and that's turns out was what was affecting their behavior. So it really comes down to using a systems approach of thinking. Like, you have to think about farms as a big interconnected space, because it is, and it's all connected to the spaces around it. So it's, once again, that awareness thing about when you're setting up your systems.
Lauren, there's a question there from Karina at 809. As the original stewards of the land themselves, how are Indigenous peoples being or should be consulted within this regenerative process? I'm not sure if you can answer that, or if David Thompson might be able to answer.
I could definitely still speak to that. So it's a really great question, Karina. Thank you for bringing that up, because like you mentioned, they are the original stewards of the land. And thank you, Claudette, once again, for doing that wonderful land acknowledgement. So when in terms of being consulted in the process, so what I recommend is actually just looking up a few examples around how it's being done by Indigenous groups, because I know there's a few projects. For example, there's a group up north who are using like geodesic domes to grow food in their northern communities, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to do the growing seasons. And there's a couple of great projects that got funded through the Youth Funding Association to do like a community garden greenhouse kind of initiative. So I could provide a couple of links maybe to be sent out afterwards. But yeah, it's definitely something that's worth consideration, especially when you are, looking to take part in activity on a land that, most of us are settlers on. So thank you for bringing that up, because that awareness is definitely a big piece as well in doing this appropriately. And somebody's asking about pollinator garden. First steps that should be taken. Okay, so that's a great question. So the best thing that you can really do is kind of look what is around already, because a lot of the time the native bees that are already living in the area, they love just native wildflowers. So goldenrod, for example, is a great one. Ones that come back every year are great, because then you can plant them once and then you know that you're going to have a reliable source of pollen and nectar. Like echinacea, for example, the big purple kind of daisy looking flowers, bees are super into those. Things that you can just spread quickly, like broadcast. I know you can get like wildflower seed mixes, and those are really handy, because rather than have to plant a bunch of different individual things, you can just kind of spread your seed mix and let that come up as like a wildflower meadow. So it's really all about variety. So there are so many different types of bees, like it's wild. So when people think of bees, they think honeybees, bumblebees, but there's like thousands. There's thousands and thousands of species of indigenous bees. Most of them are ground nesting, like I mentioned before. They make their nests in tiny little tunnels in the ground, and they don't live in colonies, and they don't sting. Like, bees are honestly so great. So thank you so much for asking how you would support them, because I think it's a really important thing for everybody to kind of give a think about. Even just like, leaving your dandelions don't pull them out. Don't pesticide your lawn, just leave them. Like those are the first sources of pollen and nectar. So just thinking about how our everyday actions, I got a 2-year-old pounding at the door again. Thinking about how our different everyday actions affect the environment, especially when we become, you know, property owners or we are occupying spaces for long periods of time. Just looking at ways we can manage things a little bit better. Herbicide alternatives. So there's a number of different things. If we're talking about weeds in a garden, so one of the best herbicide alternatives is to just mulch your garden. So in 1 second. So I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought there. So yeah, by shading out the spots where weeds would be growing, that's one of the best ways to stop them from growing in between, like your row plants, for example. So things like straw or wood chips, or even like leaves, things like that, that you can just cover the soil with so that they stay shaded, are it's like one way that you don't have to apply anything to the soil, and then it kind of cuts down on the weeding too. Mohammed, you mentioned a couple farms in the area and what they cultivate. How do we support these local farmers and what they are doing? Okay, so I want to eat in season, but it's difficult keeping track of. Okay, so one of the best ways that I meant to mention within my presentation is community shared agriculture. So CSAs are awesome because you just sign up once and then you get delivered, or you go and pick up a box of seasonal produce on like sometimes I think it's like on a monthly or like a bi-weekly or sometimes weekly basis. So Valleyfield Farms, they do a CSA, so you can either reach out directly to them or like visit them at the farmers market, and you can sign up and then you will have stuff set aside for you. Sandra just dropped the Buy Algoma website in the chat there. I think I have my, oh yeah, here's my resources page. So yeah, just getting in touch, seeing what they have. Oh yeah, okay, so yeah, CSAs are great because you don't even have to think about it. You sign up, you pay your one-time fee, and then they just give you a different variety of all of this different seasonal produce. So that's my #1 recommendation for eating seasonally, other than just visiting the farmer's market. All right. Any other questions? You can put them in the chat or just speak them out loud, unmute. Thank you for your wonderful words, Karina. A concern about backyard gardening and ground contamination. Okay, so that is a legitimate concern. So the thing about the steel plant is that they actually emit more than the provincially like acceptable levels of benzene, which is a cancer, or like a carcinogen. It's a cancer causing chemical. So like I'm sure some of you have heard about how they're shutting down the campground out in the west there, Mark's Beach, and that is due to benzene contamination as well. So the best thing I would recommend, I guess, is to do an above ground garden. So one where you're not digging right down into the soil that's already been there for a long time. So you can create like a container garden, even just like in big tote bins is something that I've used in the past, or like old recycling bins that have the drainage holes in the bottom. So that way you get soil, you know, new or compost, and you know that there's no contaminants in it. And that is pretty much my #1 recommendation in terms of that. For air contamination, there's not really much you can do about it. I mean, plants don't really, other than they don't take up stuff through the air. It's mostly through their roots, other than, you know, the carbon dioxide oxygen exchange thing. So if you were to get clean soil and have a raised garden, then that would be probably the most effective way to go about that. Any other questions? You're very welcome, Margaret. Thank you everyone for attending. Like, I saw so many names of my friends in the little participants chat there. I was like smiling the whole time before we started the presentation, just seeing everybody's little names there. So thank you for everybody that tuned in to listen, because like I mentioned, the awareness is the #1 thing.
Thank you so much, Lauren. It's Sandra here. I just want to let you know that let everyone know that Lauren's presentation will be available on the Clean North website. We are partnering with Clean North with this presentation. And if anyone wants to become involved with Sault Climate Hub, we are recruiting volunteers now. So so you're welcome to join us. Just send us a quick email at saultclimatehub@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook. And if you'd like to join our email list so that you can become informed of what's coming up and what's going on, then please send us the email again and let us know. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And if anybody has any other questions, we'd be happy to answer. Otherwise, we're going to say good night. So, all right, we had a record night tonight. We had 36 participants.